She thought my marked police cruiser was illegally parked and had it towed to prove a point. One phone call later, my chief showed up, the tow company froze, and the HOA Karen realized she hadn't just crossed a line. She committed grand theft auto in front of multiple officers. The call came in just after noon, right as I was finishing paperwork in my cruiser. I was parked legally, engine off, nose pointed toward the curb outside the small strip mall that served as the unofficial center of our town. Coffee shop, dry cleaner, nail salon, and, unfortunately, the HOA office wedged right in the middle like it owned the place. I was halfway through a cold cup of coffee when my phone buzzed, and my stomach dropped before I even knew why. Unit 12, dispatch said, her voice tight with confusion. "Be advised, your vehicle is showing as moving." I frowned and looked up. My cruiser wasn't moving. It was exactly where I'd left it. The familiar weight of my coffee cup, the stack of forms on my lap, the steady hum of afternoon traffic. Everything was normal. "Dispatch," I said slowly, trying to make sense of it. "My vehicle is stationary." There was a pause that stretched too long. Then, negative, GPS indicates it's currently in transit, heading east on County Road 7. My heart kicked hard against my ribs. I was out of the car before she finished the sentence. Coffee spilling across the pavement. The parking spot was empty. No broken glass. No skid marks. No flashing lights disappearing down the road. Just a clean stretch of asphalt where a fully marked police cruiser had been less than 2 minutes earlier. Like it had simply evaporated. For a second, my brain refused to accept it. Squad cars don't just vanish. Not in broad daylight. Not in a town where the biggest crime last week was someone stealing a porch gnome. My pulse hammered in my ears as I spun in a slow circle, searching for something, anything, that made sense. Then it hit me, and the anger came hot and fast. The HOA. I turned slowly toward their office windows, and there it was, the confirmation I didn't want but somehow expected. Inside, I could see movement, heads clustered together, animated, excited. One woman in particular stood out, blonde hair perfectly sprayed into place, arms folded tight across her chest, lips pressed into a thin, satisfied smile that made my jaw clench. Karen. She was the HOA president, self-appointed sheriff of curb space, lawn length, mailbox height, and anything else she could control with a laminated rule book and a God complex. We'd crossed paths before, mostly because she didn't like being told that HOA rules didn't outrank city law. Especially not by uniform. Especially not by me. My hand shook as I pulled out my phone and called the tow company listed on the no unauthorized parking signs she'd planted like landmines around the plaza. "Yeah," the dispatcher said cheerfully, oblivious to the storm brewing on my end. "We picked up a vehicle matching that description about 5 minutes ago." "A marked police cruiser?" I asked, my voice dangerously calm. There was a hesitation. Yes." "Who authorized the tow?" "HOA president. Said it was illegally parked and obstructing visibility." I looked at the empty space again. Wide curb, no fire lane, no signage, no obstruction. My breathing was controlled now, measured, the kind of calm that comes right before something snaps. "You're towing city property," I said flatly. "That vehicle is assigned to me. It's a police cruiser." Another pause, longer this time, and I could practically hear the realization dawning. "Sir, it's already en route to our lot." I hung up without another word, my finger trembling slightly as I lowered the phone. By the time I walked into the HOA office, Karen was practically vibrating with triumph. She didn't even try to hide it. Her eyes lit up when she saw me, like she'd been waiting for this exact moment. "I told you," she said, pointing a manicured finger at me like a weapon. "No one gets special treatment here. Not even you." The satisfaction in her voice made my teeth grind together. I forced myself to stay still, to keep my voice level. "You towed a police vehicle," I replied, each word deliberate. She smiled wider, and I felt something dangerous coil in my chest. I enforced the rules. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I didn't threaten. I just took out my phone and made one call, the only one that mattered. "Chief," I said when he picked up, my voice type controlled. "My squad car was towed, authorized by the HOA. There was silence on the other end. The kind of silence that feels like the air being sucked out of a room before an explosion. Then very calmly, "Stay where you are." Those 4 words sent a chill down my spine, and I knew Karen had just made the biggest mistake of her life. 10 minutes later, my chief pulled into the lot. Lights on, unmarked SUV, expression carved from stone. 2 patrol cars followed, then a third. The cavalry had arrived, and with them came a weight that pressed down on everything. Karen's smile faltered for the first time, confusion flickering across her face as she watched the vehicles roll in. The tow truck never made it to the yard. We intercepted it less than a mile down the road, and the relief on the driver's face was immediate when he saw us, like someone who just realized he'd been tricked into doing something very, very illegal. My cruiser was already strapped down, lifted like a trophy she claimed. Back at the plaza, the chief stood directly in front of Karen. She tried to talk, tried to explain, tried to blame procedure and authority, her voice climbing higher with each word. He cut her off with 4 words that changed everything. "You authorized the theft." Her face drained of color, and I watched every ounce of confidence leak out of her like air from a punctured tire. "Grand theft auto," he continued, his voice steady and final, "of a marked police vehicle. In this state, that's a felony." The cuffs clicked shut a moment later, and the sound echoed in the suddenly silent parking lot. As Karen was led past the same spot where my cruiser had been parked, she finally looked at me, not angry, not smug, just shocked. Genuinely, completely shocked. She thought she was towing a car. She never imagined she was stealing one. And as I watched her being placed into the back of a patrol car, I felt something settle in my chest. Not satisfaction, not revenge, just a quiet certainty that some lines exist for a reason, and she just crossed every single one. By the time I pulled into the station parking lot that morning, dread was already crawling up my spine. Something felt wrong before I even knew what it was. My usual spot, clearly marked directly under the security camera, was empty at first. I thought maybe I'd parked on the other side the night before. It happens after long shifts when exhaustion makes everything blur together. But after walking the entire lot twice, my boots echoing in the early morning quiet, the reality hit me like a cold slap. My squad car was gone. Not misplaced. Not borrowed. Gone. My chest tightened. This wasn't just any vehicle. It was a fully marked police cruiser with lights, decals, equipment, and a GPS tracker. You don't accidentally tow one. And yet, there I was, staring at bare asphalt where it should have been, feeling equal parts confused and furious. I went straight inside, my jaw clenched so tight it ached, and asked dispatch to pull the camera footage. 30 seconds later, the room went quiet. The kind of quiet that makes your skin prickle. On screen, a private tow truck rolled into lot around 2 a.m. Lights off like it had something to hide. 2 men hopped out, walked around my cruiser, and hooked it like they'd done this 1,000 times. No hesitation. No confusion. Just business. Cold, efficient, deliberate business. And standing right there, pointing and talking animatedly to the driver, was her, the HOA president. Arms crossed, chin up, smug posture radiating through the grainy footage. Even through the low resolution, I could recognize that entitled body language anywhere, the way she stood like she owned not just a neighborhood, but the entire world. According to the timestamp, she stayed until the cruiser was fully hauled away, then walked off like she just won a small victory, her shoulders squared with pride. I didn't yell. I didn't swear. I just smiled in that slow, dangerous way cops do when something clicks into place, and they know exactly how this is going to end. I called my chief, and my voice was eerily calm. 10 minutes later, he was standing beside me in the footage room, watching the clip on repeat. He didn't say a word at first. He just exhaled through his nose and folded his arms, and I could feel the anger radiating off him in waves. "She authorized this?" he asked, his voice deceptively calm. "Oh, yeah," I said, bitter satisfaction mixing with disbelief. "She's been complaining for weeks that my cruiser lowers property values when I park overnight near my own home. Apparently now she's expanded jurisdiction to police property." That was all it took. The chief picked up the phone, and made one call to the tow company. The conversation lasted less than a minute, but I watched his jaw clench tighter with every passing second. When he hung up, his knuckles were white. They admitted it, he said, the words clipped. She signed the authorization, told them it was an illegally parked vehicle. I raised an eyebrow, my stomach churning. Did they know it was a squad car? They did, he replied flatly, and somehow that made it worse. They asked. She insisted. That's when the word finally landed, heavy and irreversible, settling over us like a judge's gavel. Grand theft auto. By noon, we had the cruiser located behind a chain-link fence at the tow yard, still locked, still loaded with department equipment, still very much stolen. Looking at it through that fence, I felt a mix of relief and rage that made my hands shake. We didn't rush in with sirens. The chief wanted it done clean. By the book. No room for excuses. No chance for her to claim we'd overreacted. 2 patrol cars. 1 unmarked. The chief's SUV. And a knock on her door. She answered wearing a crisp blazer, clearly confident, probably expecting to deliver another lecture about rules and regulations. That confidence cracked the moment she saw the badges, and then shattered completely when the chief stepped forward, his presence filling her doorway. "Ma'am," he said evenly, his voice terrifyingly calm, "did you authorize the towing of a marked police vehicle last night?" She didn't deny it. That was the wild part. The part that made me realize she genuinely believed she'd done nothing wrong. "Yes," she said sharply, lifting her chin in defiance. It was parked without HOA approval. There was a pause, long, heavy, the kind of pause where the entire world seems to hold its breath. Then the chief said, "You stole city property." Her face drained of color so fast, I thought she might faint. "I know. I didn't steal anything," she stammered, her voice suddenly small. "I had it removed. There's a difference." "There isn't," he replied, and the finality in his tone made even me flinch. "You knowingly ordered the removal of a law enforcement vehicle you do not own, without authority, after being informed what it was." She laughed once. Nervous, forced, desperate. "This is ridiculous." That's when the cuffs came out, and the metallic click seemed to echo forever. The sound of metal snapping shut finally wiped the smirk off her face. Neighbors began opening doors, drawn by the commotion. Phones came out. Someone whispered, "Is she being arrested?" And the disbelief in their voice was almost palpable. Yes, she was. As they escorted her down the steps, she turned and locked eyes with me. Gone was the superiority. Gone was the entitlement. All that remained was panic, raw and genuine. "You can't do this," she hissed, and I heard the desperation bleeding through. I leaned in slightly, keeping my voice low and steady. "You did it to yourself." The tow company lost its contract with the city that afternoon. The HOA emergency meeting that night ended with her removal as president. Unanimous vote, no discussion needed. And by the next morning, my cruiser was back in its spot, untouched, polished, and now watched by 2 cameras instead of 1. Some people think rules only apply when they're in charge. This time, she learned what happens when you try to tow the law itself. By the time my squad car disappeared around the corner on the back of a tow truck, the situation had already crossed from annoying into surreal. The kind of thing that makes you question if you're actually awake or trapped in some bizarre stress dream. I stood on the sidewalk, hands on my belt, watching red taillights fade into traffic, and felt my disbelief slowly hardening into cold fury. Neighbors had begun to gather. Curtains parted, garage doors half open. Phones subtly raised to capture whatever was about to happen. And there she was, arms folded, chin lifted in triumph like she just won a courtroom battle. Instead of committing a felony she was too arrogant to recognize. The HOA president, late 40s, designer sunglasses, clipboard still tucked under one arm like a shield, smiled at me like she'd finally put a misbehaving child in timeout. The satisfaction radiating from her was almost tangible. "I warned you," she said, her voice dripping with vindication. "No unauthorized vehicles in this neighborhood." I took a slow breath, not because I was scared, but because I was buying time to decide how much rope to give her before she hanged herself with it. "That's a marked police cruiser," I said evenly, keeping my voice carefully neutral. "I'm on duty." She scoffed, actually scoffed, like I just tried to claim the sky was green. "You were parked overnight. HOA rules apply to everyone." The absolute certainty in her voice made my jaw clench. "Ma'am," I said, my patience fraying the edges, "you just authorized the towing of city property." That smile flickered for half a second, doubt creeping in. Then came back stronger, more defiant. "If you have a problem, take it up with the board." That was the moment I stopped arguing. There was no point anymore. I pulled out my phone and made one call. She leaned in, tried to listen, confident enough to stay right where she was. The tow truck was already gone. In her mind, it was over. Another victory for order. Another example of her standing her ground. I could see the triumph in her eyes, taste the smugness in the air between us. I spoke quietly into the phone, gave my name, my badge number. Then one sentence changed everything. My squad car was just towed. There was a pause on the other end. Heavy, loaded, dangerous. Then, where? I gave the location. Added, voice flat, HOA authorization. The voice on the line hardened instantly, and I felt a grim satisfaction uncurl in my chest. "Stay put." I ended the call and slipped the phone back into my pocket, my heart beating steady now. Calm in the eye of the storm, I just called down. She raised an eyebrow, still confident, still convinced she was in control. "Calling your supervisor?" "No," I said, and let the word hang there for a beat. "Calling my chief." That's when the confidence finally cracked, and I watched it happen in real time. Her posture stiffened. The clipboard shifted in her grip. "You're a chief?" Before she could say anything else, a patrol SUV turned onto the street. Then another. Then another. My backup was arriving, and the message was clear. Lights weren't on. Sirens weren't blaring. That made it worse. More deliberate, more official, more inevitable. 3 vehicles rolled in and parked calmly along the curb. Doors opened in unison. Officers stepped out, recognition flashing across their faces as they saw me standing there without my cruiser, saw her standing there with that clipboard, saw the empty space that told the whole story. And then my chief arrived. He didn't rush, didn't shout. He simply stepped out of his vehicle, adjusted his jacket with deliberate precision, and looked at the HOA president like she was a math problem with a very obvious and very wrong answer. "What happened?" he asked me, his voice dangerously calm. I explained, slowly, clearly, no emotion, just facts, the kind of testimony that holds up in court. He nodded once, processing, then turned to her, and I saw her flinch under his gaze. "Did you authorize the towing of a marked police vehicle?" he asked, each word precise. She laughed nervously, the sound brittle and forced. "It was parked illegally." He tilted his head slightly, like he was examining a particularly interesting specimen. "Did you know it belonged to the police department?" "Well, yes, but—" "Did you have permission from the city?" he continued, cutting through her excuse before it could form. "No, but the HOA—" "Ma'am," he interrupted, voice firm now, authority settling over the scene like a heavy blanket. "You authorized the removal of government property without consent." She opened her mouth, then closed it again, and I watched the realization finally begin to dawn in her eyes. One of the officers beside me quietly started taking notes, pen scratching across paper in the tense silence. My chief turned slightly and spoke to another officer, his voice carrying in the quiet street. "Contact the tow company. Tell them to stop the vehicle immediately." Another pause, this one crackling with tension. Then he looked back at her, and his expression was unreadable. "Do you know what that's called?" he asked, almost conversational. She shook her head, eyes wide now, the clipboard forgotten in her trembling hands. "Grand theft auto." The words hit her like a physical blow. Her clipboard slipped from her fingers and clattered onto the pavement with a sound that made everyone jump. I didn't steal anything," she stammered, voice climbing higher, panic seeping in. "I just had it moved." "Intent doesn't matter," my chief said, his calm more terrifying than any shout could be. "You knowingly deprived law enforcement of a vehicle in active service." At that moment, a call came through on his radio. The tow truck had been stopped less than 2 miles away. My cruiser safe. My chief nodded once, satisfaction flickering briefly across his face. "Good," he said. Then, without raising his voice, added, "Place her under arrest." The cuffs came out, and the metallic jingle sounded impossibly loud. Neighbors stepped fully into the street now, no longer hiding their fascination. Phones no longer subtle. Whispers turned into gasps, spreading to the crowd like wildfire. She tried to argue as the cuffs closed around her wrists, words tumbling over each other in desperate confusion. HOA bylaws, authority, misunderstandings, but none of it mattered anymore. The script had been written, and she'd written it herself. As she was guided toward a patrol car, she finally looked at me, and I saw something raw in her eyes. Fear mixed with disbelief, the realization that her world had just collapsed. "This isn't over," she hissed, clinging to the last shreds of her authority. I met her eyes calmly and felt nothing but certainty. "For you," I said quietly, "it already is." By the time my chief arrived, the scene already looked like a training exercise gone wrong. The kind of scenario they use to teach rookies about escalation. 2 patrol cars were angled across the lot, lights washing the tow truck in red and blue, and a small crowd of neighbors had gathered at a safe distance. Phones out, whispering like they had just stumbled onto live television. The air felt electric, charged with anticipation. The HOA Karen, her real name was Linda, but nobody ever used it anymore, stood near the curb with her arms crossed so tight I thought her clipboard might snap in half. She wore oversized sunglasses and a blazer that screamed authority cosplay. Even though it was barely 8 in the morning, her confidence hadn't cracked yet. If anything, she looked smug, like she was about to lecture us all on proper procedure. "This is ridiculous," she snapped as my chief stepped out of his vehicle, her voice sharp enough to cut. I followed procedure. That vehicle was illegally parked. My chief didn't respond right away, and I felt my pulse quicken with anticipation. He walked slowly around the tow truck, eyes scanning the hooked-up cruiser like a doctor examining a patient who'd been in an accident. He stopped at the rear bumper, leaned in, and read the unit number out loud. "Calm, measured, dangerous. Officer Ramirez," he said, finally turning to me, his expression unreadable. "This is your assigned vehicle?" "Yes, sir." My voice came out steady despite the adrenaline coursing through me. "And you were on duty?" "Yes, sir." Responding to a call 2 houses down. He nodded once, the movement deliberate, then shifted his attention to the tow operator. The driver visibly paled. "Who authorized this tow?" The driver swallowed hard, Adam's apple bobbing. "She did. Said she was with the HOA. Claimed it was abandoned." Linda stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement, "because it was blocking access. Our bylaws." My chief held up a hand. Not raised, not aggressive, just final. The kind of gesture that shut down arguments before they could start, and I watched Linda's mouth snap shut mid-sentence. "Ma'am," he said, voice flat as steel, "that vehicle is clearly marked as a police cruiser. It is registered to the city. You did not own it. You did not have authority to move it." Her lips tightened into a thin line, and I could see the stubbornness hardening in her jaw. No one is above the rules. He met her stare without blinking, and the tension ratcheted up another notch. "You're right, including you." The air shifted. I felt it in my chest, like the pressure drop before a storm hits. That moment when you know something big is coming, and there's no way to stop it. He turned to one of the responding officers, and I held my breath. "Did you advise her this was a police vehicle?" "Yes, sir. Twice." "And did she insist on proceeding?" "Yes, sir." The crowd murmured, a ripple of shocked understanding passing through them. Linda's sunglasses came off now, her hands trembling slightly as she lowered them, her eyes darting just slightly, searching for an exit that wasn't there. My chief took a breath, and I knew this was it. "Ma'am, by ordering the removal of a police vehicle without authorization, you knowingly exercise control over property belonging to the city." She scoffed, but the sound was weaker now, less certain. "That's not theft. That's enforcement." "It becomes theft," he replied, his voice cutting through her protest like a blade, "when you refuse to stop after being informed." The words landed heavy, Final, irreversible. He nodded to another officer, and my heart hammered. Place her under arrest for grand theft auto. For a split second, Linda laughed. A sharp, disbelieving sound that cracked in the middle. You can't be serious. Then the cuffs came out, glinting in the morning sun. That was when reality finally hit her like a freight train. Wait! This is a misunderstanding, she said, backing up, her voice climbing into panic. I'm the HOA president. Then you should know better, my chief said, and the disappointment in his voice was somehow worse than anger would have been. As they cuffed her, the crowd went silent except for one neighbor who whispered, "Oh my God," the words hanging in the shocked stillness. The tow operator quietly unhooked my cruiser, handshaking, avoiding eye contact with anyone like he wished he could disappear. The truck rolled away without a word, leaving behind only the echo of what had just happened. Linda was escorted toward the patrol car she tried to steal. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Her posture collapsed with every step, the transformation brutal to watch. Gone was the blazer-clad tyrant who'd terrorized the neighborhood for years. In her place was someone small, pale, and furious in the way only people who've never faced consequences can be, righteous in their disbelief. As they closed the door, she locked eyes with me through the window. The glare promised complaints, lawsuits, emails, retaliation, everything in her arsenal. I didn't smile. I didn't speak. I just watched, feeling something settle in my chest. Not quite satisfaction, but a sense of balance being restored. Because for the first time since she'd moved into the neighborhood and declared herself queen, she wasn't in charge of the situation. And everyone saw it. My chief turned to me once the scene settled, the crowd beginning to disperse. "You good?" "Yes, sir." And I meant it. He nodded, a hint of approval in his eyes. "File your report. I'll handle the rest." As he walked away, I looked around at the neighbors who'd spent years avoiding HOA meetings, swallowing fines, painting their mailboxes approved colors, and rolling their eyes in private. The ones who'd lived under a thumb, afraid to push back. They weren't whispering anymore. They were smiling. And for the first time, I realized this wasn't just about my squad car. It was about finally reminding someone that power doesn't come from a clipboard or a title, but from knowing where the line is and not crossing it. The parking lot went quiet in a way that only happens when real authority walks in, the kind that doesn't need to announce itself. Conversations died mid-sentence. Engines idled, then shut off one by one. The HOA president, still puffed up from her earlier tirade, froze when she saw my chief step out of his vehicle. Uniform crisp, expression unreadable in that way that makes your stomach drop. 2 patrol cars rolled in behind him, lights off but unmistakable. The tow truck driver swallowed, so hard I could see it from across the lot. My chief didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Authority radiated from him like heat from asphalt in summer. He walked straight to the HOA Karen and asked one simple question. "Did you authorize the towing of this marked police vehicle?" She launched into a rehearsed speech about community rules and illegal parking, waving her clipboard like a shield, her voice rising with indignation. She insisted she had full authority as HOA president and claimed the cruiser was abandoned, blocking access, violating ordinances. The words poured out in a defensive rush, and I could see she genuinely believed every one of them. The chief let her finish, let her dig herself deeper. Then he calmly asked the tow operator who had ordered the tow, and I watched the driver's face crumble. The driver pointed at her with a trembling finger. That was the moment everything changed, the axis of the world tilting just slightly off-center. My chief nodded once, his expression still unreadable, then turned to me. Where was the cruiser taken? When I gave him the address, he radioed it in, his voice clipped and professional. Then he looked back at the HOA president and explained, slowly, clearly, with the patience of someone teaching a lesson that should have been learned years ago, that a marked police vehicle, actively assigned and parked for official business, is not subject to HOA authority. Removing it without authorization constituted unlawful taking of a government vehicle. Grand theft auto. Her face drained of color, so fast I thought she might collapse. The clipboard slipped from her fingers and hit the asphalt with a hollow crack that echoed in the sudden silence. She tried to backpedal, stumbling over her words, claiming it was a misunderstanding, that she thought it was just some car with decals. My chief gestured to the bold police lettering, the light bar, the unit number, the dash camera, clearly visible through the windshield and photos already pulled up on his phone. His movements were deliberate, methodical, building an airtight case right there in the parking lot. There was no misunderstanding, he said, and the finality in his voice made even me flinch. The chief read her rights right there in the parking lot, his voice carrying across the silent crowd. Residents who had once nodded along to her power trips now watched in stunned, almost reverent silence as cuffs went on. Phones came out, documenting the fall. Someone whispered, "She actually did it." Another muttered, "She towed a cop." The disbelief thick in their voice. The tow company wasn't spared either. The chief informed the driver that they were on the hook for immediate recovery, damages, and an internal review for failing to verify authorization. The company would pay for this mistake in more ways than one. The truck keys were handed over with shaking hands, and an officer followed him to retrieve my cruiser, leaving behind a scene that felt surreal. When the car came back, I walked around it slowly, my chest tight with a mix of relief and lingering anger. Scratches along the bumper, tire marks where chains had rubbed. Nothing catastrophic, but enough to matter, enough to cost money, enough to leave a record, enough to make this real. The HOA board emergency convened that same evening without their president, the meeting tense and whispered. By the next morning, an email went out to every homeowner. The subject line stark. She was suspended pending legal proceedings. A week later, she resigned. A one-sentence email that probably took her hours to write. Each word a surrender. Charges stuck like glue. She tried to fight it at first. Hired a lawyer, claimed overreach, argued semantics and intent. But the evidence was airtight, suffocating in its completeness. Security footage, tow logs, witness statements, HOA emails where she bragged about teaching the officer a lesson, words that came back to haunt her in ways she never imagined. That email alone ended any hope she had of walking away clean. The judge didn't buy the excuses, and I was there for the sentencing, sitting in the back row, watching. She avoided prison time, but the consequences were heavy enough to crush. Probation that would follow her for years, fines that drained her savings, restitution for damages that kept climbing, legal fees that bled into the tens of thousands, and a permanent record she couldn't HOA boss her way out of. She was also barred from holding any HOA position again, ever, in any community. The ruling was thorough, deliberate, final. The neighborhood changed overnight, like someone had lifted a fog. The rule violation letters stopped arriving in mailboxes. The petty fines vanished. Board meetings became quiet, procedural, boring, in the best possible way. People waved again. Kids rode bikes without getting yelled at for imaginary infractions. For the first time since I'd moved in, it actually felt like community instead of a dictatorship with flower beds and color-coordinated mailboxes. As for me, my chief made it clear he had my back, but also reminded me to document everything going forward, to never assume this couldn't happen again. I did. Every interaction, every email, every sign posted, because power doesn't disappear. It just waits for someone else to grab it, and I wanted to be ready. The HOA never apologized. They didn't have to. The silence was enough. The absence of harassment more meaningful than any words could be. And every time I park that cruiser in my driveway now, nobody says a word. No notes tucked under wipers. No threats left in my mailbox. No towing trucks lurking at midnight. Because everyone remembers the day one woman thought she was above the law, and learned the hard way that some lines don't bend. Not for anyone. Not even for her.